Welcome to Lights Out Stories. New stories drop every week. If you want to be here when they do, hit subscribe and settle in. Tonight's story is called The Silk Road. It's about a young man who sat down at a laptop, combined two new technologies that most people had never heard of, and built a marketplace unlike anything that had ever existed. A place where you could buy almost anything, anonymously, from anyone in the world, with money that left no trace. He believed he was changing the world. He was right. This is the story of what happened next. So get comfortable, turn the lights down, and let's get into it. The internet was going to set us free. That was the promise. Not the commercial promise, not the banner ads and the e-commerce and the cable companies selling you faster access to streaming video. The original promise, the one that the people who built it believed in the way you believe in things when you are young and working on something that has never been done before and have not yet seen how things tend to go. The promise was this: information wants to be free. And if information is free, then people are free. And if people are free, then governments and banks and the institutions that control the flow of money and the flow of goods and the flow of ideas would no longer have the kind of power they had always had, because that power depended on control. And the internet, at its core, was a machine for defeating control. This was the belief. For a long time, it was possible to hold it. Eli Marsh was 26 years old when he started building the site. He grew up in Austin, Texas. His father was an electrical engineer. His mother taught high school biology. They were the kind of family that valued education the way other families valued money, as the foundational thing, the thing that made the other things possible. His childhood was books and science fairs and long discussions at the dinner table about ideas that had nothing to do with anyone's immediate circumstances. He was good at everything that could be measured: math, physics, programming. He had a mind that moved through abstract systems the way other people's minds move through physical spaces. Naturally, without effort. Finding paths that weren't obvious because he was looking at the structure rather than the surface. He went to a state university on a full scholarship, studied economics, then biochemistry, then economics again. He couldn't settle. The problem was that everything interested him, and nothing interested him enough. He wanted to work on a problem that mattered. Not mattered in the university sense, publishable, peer-reviewed, contributing to the incremental advance of a field. Mattered in the larger sense, the sense that had driven the men who built the early internet, who had stayed up through the night in rooms that smelled of coffee and old carpet because they were working on something that was going to change everything, and they knew it. What he landed on, after 2 years of graduate study that he eventually left without a degree, was a simple conviction. The state had no right to tell people what they could put in their own bodies. This was not a new idea. It had a long philosophical tradition. John Stuart Mill had written about it in the 19th century. The libertarian thinkers he read carefully, Murray Rothbard, Friedrich Hayek, the theorists of individual sovereignty and voluntary exchange, had argued it in different forms across decades. The drug war, as Eli understood it, was not a moral project. It was a control project. It kept certain substances illegal not because their harm could be demonstrated relative to legal alternatives, but because their illegality justified the expansion of state power. The DEA, the prison system, the civil asset forfeiture laws that allowed police to seize property without a conviction. He had a folder on his laptop called Reading that contained several hundred essays, papers, and book excerpts. He had read all of them, some multiple times. He was not a violent person. He was not a criminal in any recognizable sense. He had never been arrested. He paid his taxes. He was, to everyone who knew him, a thoughtful and somewhat intense young man with a lot of ideas and a talent for computers. He was also, by the time he started building the site, completely convinced that the system was wrong. And he had figured out a way to do something about it. The first technology was called Tor. Tor stood for the onion router. It had been developed, in an irony that would not be lost on people who studied the story later, by the United States Naval Research Laboratory in the mid-1990s. The idea was to create a system for anonymous communication that could be used by intelligence operatives communicating from hostile countries, a way to route internet traffic through a series of encrypted relays so that the origin of any communication could not be traced. The Navy had eventually released it as open source software. This was either an act of principled commitment to the free flow of information or a miscalculation of what people would do with it, depending on your perspective. What people did with it was build a parallel internet. Within the Tor network, websites could exist at addresses ending in .onion, not accessible through ordinary browsers, not indexed by search engines, not visible to anyone who didn't know the specific address and had the specific software to reach it. The dark web, people called it. Not a metaphor, a technical description of a layer of the internet that existed in the dark, away from the light of ordinary access. Tor made it possible to be anonymous. The second technology made it possible to exchange value anonymously. Bitcoin had been invented in 2008 by someone whose identity was unknown. The paper describing it was published under a pseudonym, Satoshi Nakamoto, and the true identity of the person or people behind it had never been established despite years of investigation by journalists, cryptographers, and law enforcement agencies who had very specific reasons to want to know. Whoever Satoshi was, they had built something remarkable. Bitcoin was a decentralized digital currency. No bank controlled it. No government issued it. It existed as entries in a public ledger called the blockchain, a record maintained not by any single institution, but by a distributed network of computers around the world, each verifying each transaction against the others so that no single point of failure or control existed. You could send Bitcoin to anyone, anywhere, without a bank processing the transaction, without a name attached to the payment, without a record that connected the currency to your identity, if you were careful about how you acquired it. Together, Tor and Bitcoin were two halves of a solution to a problem that had previously seemed unsolvable. How do you create an anonymous marketplace? You need two things: anonymity of location so that the seller cannot be found, and anonymity of payment so that the money cannot be traced. Tor provided the first. Bitcoin provided the second. Eli Marsh saw this in the spring of 2010 and understood it in about 40 minutes. He started coding in his apartment. It was a one-bedroom place near the university, where he still maintained a loose affiliation with the economics department, while mostly pursuing his own projects. The apartment was clean in the functional sense. Dishes washed, floor swept, but spare in a way that suggested the person living there was not particularly interested in the physical space. A desk, a good chair, 3 monitors, books stacked horizontally because the shelves were full, a plant that he watered irregularly but that had survived anyway. He worked alone. This was not a startup in the traditional sense. No co-founders, no investors, no advisors. He had considered briefly whether he needed help. He had decided no. The project required secrecy above everything else, and secrecy was incompatible with collaboration, with other people who could talk, who could be pressured, who could be turned. He was building something that would be illegal. He understood this clearly. The site he was building would allow people to buy and sell drugs. Not exclusively. Anything could be sold in theory. Anything that willing adults chose to exchange. But drugs were the obvious use case. The application that made the value of the system undeniable. And drugs were illegal. The substances were illegal. The distribution was illegal. The commerce was illegal under the laws of every country on earth. He had a framework for this. He had thought about it carefully, the way he thought about everything carefully, and he had arrived at a position that he held with the confidence of a man who has tested an idea from many angles and found it solid. The law, in this case, was wrong. The law was an instrument of state power that had been turned against individual liberty. And when the law was wrong, the obligation to follow it was weaker than the obligation to do what was right. This was not an uncommon view in the history of civil disobedience. It was what Thoreau had argued, what the Underground Railroad had demonstrated, what every person who had ever helped a neighbor evade an unjust law had understood, at some level, without needing the philosophy to explain it. He wrote some of this down in a journal. Then he went back to coding. The site launched in January of 2011. It was not much to look at. A simple interface, deliberately minimal. A home page with a logo. A camel against a desert background. A reference to the ancient trade routes that had connected civilizations across Asia and the Middle East before the modern nation-state had divided the world into jurisdictions. A product listing page. A basic messaging system. A system for holding payment in escrow while transactions were completed. The early listings were almost entirely mushrooms. Psychedelic mushrooms, which are a Schedule I controlled substance in the United States, sold by a small number of vendors who had found the site through the same libertarian internet forums where Eli had been thinking out loud for years. The first week, there were a few $100s in transactions. The second week, a little more. Then a technology journalist published an article about a dark web drug marketplace that was using Bitcoin and Tor to operate beyond the reach of law enforcement. The article described the site in enough detail to be identifiable. It named it. It explained, in enough technical terms to be comprehensible to a general audience, how the anonymity worked. Within 48 hours, the site had more traffic than it could handle. He named himself Dread Pirate Roberts. The name was from a movie, The Princess Bride, which he had watched as a child and which contained, buried in its comic adventure plot, an idea that he found genuinely interesting. In the film, Dread Pirate Roberts was not a single person, but a title, an identity passed from one person to the next, so that the legend and the fear associated with the name outlasted any individual who held it. The pirate who terrified people was not a man. It was a role. It was the idea of a man. He liked this for reasons that were both practical and philosophical. Practically, it meant that if he ever needed to distance himself from the operation, the name could be passed on. It created the fiction of multiple people, which made investigation harder. It was good operational security. Philosophically, it reflected something true about what he was doing. He was not, in his own understanding, acting as an individual. He was enacting a principle. The Silk Road was not Eli Marsh's project. It was the first practical demonstration of a set of ideas about individual liberty and voluntary exchange that had been theoretical until now. The ideas were bigger than the person holding them. If something happened to him, someone else could carry them forward. He used the name in all communications on the site. He had separate identities, separate computers, a complex architecture of precautions that he had spent months developing. His real name appeared nowhere in the network that ran the Silk Road. He was, as far as the internet was concerned, a myth. The business grew. There is no other word for it, and the word is important, because the Silk Road was, whatever else it was, a business. It had operations and logistics and customer service and vendor relations and a dispute resolution system and a reputation management problem and all the other things that businesses have. It was just a business whose products were illegal and whose operators were anonymous and whose transactions were conducted in a currency that most people had never heard of. The numbers, when they eventually became public through legal proceedings, were striking. At its peak, the Silk Road processed roughly $1 million in transactions per month. Vendor commissions, the percentage the platform took on each sale, ran between 8 and 15%, depending on volume. The product categories expanded from mushrooms to include nearly every controlled substance available: cannabis, cocaine, MDMA, heroin, prescription opioids, LSD. Vendors from dozens of countries. Buyers from dozens more. The escrow system was Eli's design. When a buyer purchased something from a vendor, the Bitcoin went into escrow, held by the platform, until the buyer confirmed receipt and satisfaction. This protected buyers from being defrauded by vendors and gave vendors an incentive to fulfill orders accurately, because their reputation on the platform determined their volume. Bad vendors got bad reviews and lost business. Good vendors built loyal customer bases and grew. He had not expected to care about this. He discovered that he did. There was something about the system working, about buyers and sellers reaching voluntary agreements and completing them successfully, that satisfied something in him. The marketplace was functioning. The philosophy was producing observable results. People were getting what they wanted without coercion, without violence, without the apparatus of enforcement. For a time, this felt like vindication. He ran the Silk Road from coffee shops. Not any single coffee shop. He rotated, never establishing a pattern, always paying cash, always connecting through layers of anonymity that made tracing the connection from the coffee shop's Wi-Fi to the server that hosted the site practically impossible. He carried a laptop that contained nothing that could be directly connected to the site. He had a separate machine, kept in his apartment, that he used for actual administration of the platform, never connected to his real identity, never accessed from his home IP address. He had read everything published on operational security. He had studied the mistakes that people in his position had made before him. He was, by any reasonable assessment, significantly more careful than average. He was not careful enough. But that was later. In the first year, and for most of the second, the operation ran smoothly. He was making more money than he had ever imagined making. Not that money was the point, and this was something he returned to frequently in his private writing, insisting to himself that the money was a means and not an end. But the money was real. It accumulated in Bitcoin wallets that no bank could see and no government could freeze. And it represented a kind of freedom that was also new, also unprecedented, also a demonstration of what the technologies could do. He lived simply. He did not buy things. He ate at the same places he had always eaten, drove the same used car, wore the same kinds of clothes. His friends, the few he maintained real relationships with, noticed that he seemed preoccupied, that he was less available than he had been, that something was occupying his attention that he wasn't talking about. He told them he was working on a project. He told them it was complicated. The federal agencies that would eventually dismantle the Silk Road did not begin their investigations at the same time or with the same information. The Drug Enforcement Administration began looking at it in 2011, shortly after the journalist's article ran. A DEA agent in Baltimore was assigned to it, a long-term undercover operation, the kind that takes years and requires patience and the willingness to move very slowly because the target is careful. The Internal Revenue Service came in later, through a different door, the financial side. Bitcoin was new enough that many people in law enforcement did not understand it. The IRS Criminal Investigation Division had people who did. The blockchain, despite being designed to protect privacy, contained a public record of every transaction. If you could connect a Bitcoin wallet address to a real identity, even once, at one end of one transaction, you could begin to trace the flow of money backward and forward from that point. The FBI ran a parallel investigation out of its New York field office. None of these agencies were fully sharing information with the others in the early stages. This was not unusual. Interagency cooperation in federal law enforcement is, in practice, far more complicated than it appears in the organizational charts. What was unusual was how long it took. The Silk Road operated openly. Not openly in the surface web sense, but openly enough that any reasonably determined person with the right software could find it. The journalist's article had described it in enough detail that a large portion of the interested internet had gone looking. Law enforcement agencies had been aware of its existence since early 2011. It continued to operate until October 2013. 2 years and 9 months. For most of that time, the man running it slept reasonably well. The cracks, when they appeared, were not where he expected them. He had built elaborate technical defenses. The server infrastructure was distributed across multiple countries, hosted under false identities, maintained through layers of indirection that made tracing the physical machines to their operator deeply difficult. The Bitcoin transactions were routed through a mixer, a service that obscured the trail of currency by pooling it with other transactions before sending it onward. What he had not fully accounted for was people. Running a platform with the scale and complexity of the Silk Road required help. Not a lot of help. He was careful about this, aware that every person who knew about the operation was a potential risk. But some. He needed administrators who could handle the volume of support requests and disputes that a marketplace with tens of thousands of users generated. He needed someone who understood server security at a level that complemented his own. He hired people from within the platform's own community, moderators who had been present since the early days, whose usernames he knew and whose values he believed he understood. He paid them in Bitcoin. He never met them in person. He barely knew their real names. He did not know for a long time that at least one of them was cooperating with federal investigators. He did not know that one of his most trusted administrators had been arrested on separate charges and under pressure had provided investigators with information that moved the investigation significantly forward. The architecture of secrecy that he had built was sound. The human layer was not. By 2013, he was tired. This is not a detail that appeared in the news coverage, which focused on the audacity of the enterprise and the scale of the illegal commerce and the philosophical framework that its operator had articulated in public communications on the site. But it was real. He had been running the Silk Road for nearly 3 years, largely alone, under conditions of self-imposed isolation that had costs he had not fully anticipated when he started. He could not talk about his work. He could not share his problems. He could not mention to the people in his life the scale of what he had built or the complexity of the challenges he was managing, or the specific satisfaction he felt when the system worked smoothly, which was the closest thing he had to professional pride. He kept a journal, not on the laptop he used for the site, on a separate machine, a personal record of his thinking that he intended as a kind of document for the future, a record of what he had been trying to do and why. He wrote in it regularly. He was a careful writer, precise and thoughtful, the same qualities that showed up in his programming and in the way he structured his arguments. The journal would later be recovered by federal investigators and entered into evidence. It contained many things. It contained his economic arguments for what he was doing. It contained his fears. It contained his frustrations with specific vendors and specific administrators. It contained the record of decisions he had made that he was less proud of than others, moments when the operation had produced consequences he had not intended and that had required responses he had not planned for. It also contained something that would be cited extensively in the press coverage that followed his arrest. A sentence. A single sentence written on a night when he was alone in his apartment, several months before the end, that read, "I've created a monster." He was arrested on a Tuesday afternoon in October of 2013. He was in a public library in San Francisco, the science fiction section on the third floor. He had been there before, had used public libraries for sensitive work because the Wi-Fi was open, and the presence of many different people made individual behavior hard to observe. He was logged in to the Silk Road's administrative interface. The FBI agents who arrested him had worked out, over months of patient investigation, that he was there. They had worked out, through a combination of technical analysis and human intelligence, and the kind of slow, methodical assembly of small facts that good investigators perform, who he was and where he would be. They had also worked out a specific tactical problem. A laptop computer that is encrypted can be rendered inaccessible within seconds if the user closes it and the encryption software locks. If they approached him and he had time to close the laptop, the evidence would be locked behind an encryption they did not have the keys to break. The solution was theatrical. Two agents staged a loud argument in the aisle near where he was sitting. The kind of argument that draws attention. Raised voices. The suggestion of a physical altercation. He turned to look, the way anyone in a library would turn to look at a sudden disturbance. In the moment he was looking away, a third agent stepped behind him and pulled the laptop from his hands while it was open and active. The arrest took approximately 15 seconds from the moment the staged argument began. He was sitting at a library table one moment. He was in handcuffs the next. The trial lasted from November 2014 to February 2015. The evidence was extensive. The laptop, with its open administrative session, had provided access to the site's entire back end. The financial records, the communications, the user data, the transaction history. The journal he had kept provided something more difficult to construct from technical evidence, a record of his thinking, his intentions, his awareness of what he was doing. The defense argued that the evidence had been obtained illegally, that the investigation had involved unconstitutional surveillance, that agents had tampered with evidence. Some of these arguments were legally interesting. Some raised genuine questions about the methods that had been used. None of them worked. The jury convicted on all counts. The judge, at sentencing, was direct about how she understood the case. The Silk Road had processed, over its operating lifetime, roughly $200 million in illegal transactions. It had enabled the distribution of heroin, cocaine, and other substances to hundreds of thousands of people. The counterfactual, what would have happened to those transactions in the absence of the Silk Road, was contested. Some experts argued that most buyers would have found other means. The platform had not created demand but redirected it. Others argued that the ease and safety of the platform had meaningfully expanded access to substances that would otherwise have been harder to obtain. The judge did not resolve this debate. She sentenced Eli Marsh to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was 29 years old. The Silk Road was shut down the day of the arrest. Visitors to the .onion address found a seizure notice, a banner from the FBI, stark and official, where the marketplace had been. The image circulated widely. There was something about it that crystallized what had happened. The replacement of a complex functioning marketplace by a federal seal. Within a month, successor sites appeared on the dark web. Silk Road 2.0, Alpha Bay. Other names, other operators, other architectures built on the same two technologies, Tor and Bitcoin, that Eli Marsh had combined in his Austin apartment in 2010. Law enforcement shut some of them down. Others operated for years. The cycle of marketplace and seizure and new marketplace became a permanent feature of the dark web ecosystem. The technologies that made anonymous commerce possible did not go away because one person had been arrested. The knowledge of how to combine them did not go away. The demand for what they enabled did not go away. The FBI had removed the Silk Road. They had not removed the Silk Road. In the months after the arrest, a particular debate took shape in certain corners of the internet that took these questions seriously. The question was not whether what Eli Marsh had done was legal. It was not legal. The question was what it meant. Some people argued that it meant very little, that a drug marketplace on the internet was a drug marketplace, that the ideological framing was self-serving, that the harm produced by the distribution of heroin and other opioids was not abstract, and that the people making libertarian arguments about voluntary exchange were not the people whose family members were dying. Some people argued that it meant a great deal, that the Silk Road had demonstrated something genuine and important about the possibility of anonymous commerce, that the technology it had pioneered was now being used for purposes that had nothing to do with drug markets, that the ideas it had embodied were going to shape the future of the internet, whether or not the specific platform survived. Some people argued that both things were true simultaneously, and that this was exactly the kind of problem that did not have a clean resolution. The debate continued. It continues now. There is a detail from the early days of the site that Eli Marsh wrote about in his journal, and that was introduced at trial, and that appears, in some form, in almost every serious account of the Silk Road. In the first months of operation, when the site was small and the community was small, and he was managing everything himself, he would sometimes log in late at night and read the messages that users sent to the platform's general inbox. Most were practical. Questions about how the escrow system worked, complaints about specific vendors, technical inquiries about Bitcoin. But some were different. Some were from people who were not buying or selling anything. Some were from people who had found the site and who wanted, apparently, to say something to whoever was on the other end, to make contact with the idea of it, if not with the specific person. He kept some of these messages. One of them, from a user whose handle he did not recognize, read, "I don't know who built this, or why, or what it will become, but I've never seen anything like it. It feels like the internet kept its promise for once." He wrote about that message in his journal more than once. He was thinking about it, apparently, for a long time. The Bitcoin wallets associated with the Silk Road contained, at the time of seizure, roughly 144,000 Bitcoin. In 2013, at the time of the arrest, this was worth approximately $28 million. Bitcoin's value fluctuated dramatically in the years that followed. dropping, recovering, rising, dropping again, rising to levels that would have been unimaginable in 2013. The United States Marshal Service, which manages assets seized in federal cases, auctioned the Bitcoin in several tranches. The last and largest auction was won by a venture capitalist who was known for his enthusiasm for the technology and who gave interviews about his belief in Bitcoin's long-term value. He paid approximately $48 million for the final tranche. Those coins, at the peak of Bitcoin's value in 2021, were worth approximately $1.7 billion. The government had auctioned them for $48 million. This is a fact that appears, without exception, in every serious account of the Silk Road. It tends to generate more commentary than almost anything else. Eli Marsh is in federal prison. He has been there since 2015. He has filed multiple appeals. They have not succeeded. He writes. He reads. He has, by accounts from people who have visited or corresponded with him, remained intellectually engaged with the ideas that led him to build the Silk Road, with questions about liberty, about state power, about the relationship between law and morality. He does not appear, from those accounts, to have arrived at simple answers. He had a plant in his apartment. There is no record of what happened to it. The Tor network currently has roughly 2 million users. Bitcoin has a market capitalization, as of recent accounting, in the hundreds of billions of dollars. The dark web contains at any given time thousands of active markets and forums and services, a parallel internet that would not exist in its current form without the architecture that the Silk Road pioneered and the attention that its seizure brought. Law enforcement agencies in every major country have dedicated units focused on dark web activity. They have developed sophisticated techniques for tracing Bitcoin transactions that the early users of the currency believed were untraceable. They have made many arrests. They have not closed the dark web. They cannot close the dark web. This is a fact that Eli Marsh understood in 2010, sitting in his apartment, looking at two technologies and what they could do together. He was right about that. He was right about other things too. He was wrong about what it would cost him. He sat at a library table. He had built something no one had built before. He believed the idea was bigger than the person. He was right. The person is in a cell. The idea is still out there, in the dark, waiting. Rest now. Some things don't have endings, only the night.